Hey everybody, Invisiblekatana here, and today I would like to discuss our favorite mechanics in bad video games. Now, the inspiration for this was honestly me just thinking, what the F am I going to talk about today? And with the discourse of all things Devil May Cry, I was like, Devil May Cry 2, not great. But it's got some stuff in there that's worth talking about. I mentioned, I think it was the first episode I did on this series, favorite unlockables. Devil May Cry 2 literally has an entire third character that you can unlock. No one would do that, of course, unless Devil May Cry 2 was like the first Devil May Cry game you had on the PlayStation 2, and that's why I did that, because you had to beat the game with both characters on hard difficulty to unlock that third character. No one's going to do that today, but also there's a cheat code, so if you happen to have the HD collection, go ahead and check that out. I know you didn't play enough to get Trish, because once again, who would? But just check that out. She was still cool. But with Devil May Cry, like I said, being in the zeitgeist and stuff, it definitely popped into my head, with all the videos I've seen, everyone, of course, is saying every time something comes up with the anime and how much they like it, don't like it, how much we love the games, don't like the games, it's don't really like the reboot, and nobody likes to. And that's pretty much the general discourse. So I was like, you know what? Just to give it something good, because it has some good stuff in it. Let's go with that. So our favorite mechanics and the worst games. And of course, everybody's opinion is different. Games we like, other people don't like. So if it's a game that you just don't think is good, but there's that one mechanic where you're just like, that's really cool. I wish that thing was, in other things, even if it's within the same franchise or just different games in general. I would love to hear it. So please, put that stuff down in the comments. But kicking it off with Devil May Cry, the mechanic that I think they have in that game that's actually good, and I think this only really applies to specifically the franchise itself and not, just games as a whole. In the game, they have different elemental triggers that you can add to your devil trigger. And that was always really cool back in the day. And they don't have that for any of the other games. That was something that was only in the second game. And they got rid of it, which I always thought kind of sucked, because I was like, that's actually once again, one of the few, maybe the only mechanic outside of adding Bloody Palace mode as an entire mode to the franchise. But that was really the only thing combat-wise that they had that was a really cool mechanic. And actually that's not true, because they had also a secret devil trigger mode, which at this point is considered, with the release of Devil May Cry 5, it's kind of been backwards, canonized as Sin Devil Trigger. And it's hey, that was in Devil May Cry 2 as the ultimate power form, which apparently a lot of people didn't know about. Once again, I'm one of the people that actually played Devil May Cry enough to unlock Trish, so that means I had to have beaten the game 4 times. So, there's that. I obviously might know some stuff that people never even care to, know about that game. But I thought that was just a common thing. It's hey, if you're low on health and then you go into Devil Trigger, you go into this insane super mode where you can, so obviously this is one of the weird things about DMC2. When you shoot in the Devil Trigger form in DMC2, the guns disappear and the bullets just shoot straight out of his hands, which I always thought was an interesting mechanic. I actually always thought that kind of looked cool and weird, he just holds his hands up. It's almost like some DBZ stuff, and you're just and just shooting straight out of your hands. But in the super, which we'll just call it Sin Devil Trigger mode at this point, because it's the same as 5, you get comets shooting out of your effing hands. He flies up into the air, he looks totally different, he looks super cool, and you're just blasting comets out of your hands. And that's what it was like. And you could only do it, your health had to be super low, and then you could unlock it, and you would have this insane mode that lasted, for a very short amount of time. It was much shorter than the regular Devil Trigger, and it was this explosive, final bout of energy and power. And if you were able to tap into that, if you could pull it off right, you could destroy enemies. It was insane. And you, like I said, legit, if you just look up footage of it, it was crazy. And the sword would turn into this crazy laser sword that would come out of his hand and stuff. It looked insane. It was a ridiculous thing that, for some odd reason, and also it's not I ever beat the game on every difficulty, but I don't think you could ever unlock that mode as a permanent thing where it's hey, you beat every difficulty or whatever, here you go, here's the ultimate Devil Trigger form as as a replacement to your Devil Trigger. I don't think they had that in there. I think it was only a mechanic if your health was low. But that was really cool. I would have loved to have seen that in Devil May Cry 3. It probably wouldn't have fit just story-wise. It still would have been super cool, of course, if it was just hey, here you go, just when you're in your last bit of health, you just go into a stronger form. But in 4 it could have worked, for Dante, of course, and in 5 you technically have it as your base form now. But in Devil May Cry 2, I thought that was a cool mechanic that they definitely could have added going forward in the franchise. Like I said, even with 3, if it didn't, like, oh, it kind of doesn't work story-wise, it's like, sure, you can say it does, though. You could just throw it in there as, like, when he's in his last bit, it's that final, it's the classic anime move, like, you're at your last bit of health, but then, if it's Bleach, Kirie is like, or not Kirie, man, I'm mixing things up because of the voice actor, but Orihime, there you go. She's just like, hey, don't die, and then poof, Ichigo is just like, I'm gonna just stop you with one hand. Like, that was probably the most ridiculous thing I've ever seen in an anime, and that's saying a lot. But I'm like, I know everyone has like the random speech thing, but I think of that a lot for Bleach, where I'm like, Grimjaw was beating the F out of that dude, and she was just like, please don't die, Ichigo, and he was like, okay, and he just stopped his hand with one hand. I'm like, he was whooping on you, and that's all it took? Okay. That was like the most extreme version of it I feel I've ever seen in anime, where it's like just the inspirational moment. All she said was like, please don't die. And then he just full 180, and he won in like literally one hit. He stopped a strike, and then I'm spoiling stuff. But anyway, back to the actual Devil May Cry stuff. That's a mechanic I think could have been in the game. I thought it was super cool. It could have, stayed within the franchise. And then to go back to what I even initially talked about, I know I jumped off of it. I did not forget. But the elemental stuff I thought was pretty cool, because the way that they go through the game for the Devil Trigger in general is you unlock bits and pieces. So it's like, all right, well, here's what you get for like the flames. Like, they have fire, ice, and I believe electricity. And I think you get all 3 elements for all 3 parts of the Devil Trigger. I know one is like for flying, you get one for flight, which I don't remember the exact mechanics of. Like, it's so hard to remember. It's been forever since I played the second game. But it would be like little stuff. And once again, even with it being Devil May Cry 2, I feel like it felt more visual. Even as a kid, I was like, it doesn't feel like it really does that much, but I'm sure it has some mechanic where like flames do actually affect over time, and maybe lightning does this or that. I don't think ice ever actually froze enemies, but maybe I'm wrong. That might be the one thing I'm thinking of. Like, I feel like I remember ice, but I could also just be mixing all the games together, because in Devil May Cry 1 and 4, they have enemies that like appear frozen in ice, and I'm like, plus you got Cerberus, and I'm like, I could just be mixing up like every other thing of ice I've ever thought of throughout the entire effing franchise, which is literally every game, I think, except for, literally every Devil May Cry game has something to do with ice, and either whether it's an enemy or a weapon that you get. And I'm like, I could just be mixing it up, but I know that it was like fire, ice, and I'm pretty sure lightning was the other one. And so they had those different mechanics. And like I said, it's been forever, so I'm sure they had some sort of effect. And had they kept that, they could have actually implemented it way more. And it's like, hey, these specific enemies might be weak to this. So if you happen to go into your Devil Trigger and you have like, the flame attachment, then you can you can weaken them. And if you do, obviously if you have 3 components for 2, I wish I could remember. All I remember is the crescent moon specifically was like the aerial piece. That's all I can remember 100%. And then there was one that was like a circle, or maybe it was just those 2. Maybe it wasn't 3, and it was only 2. And like the aerial had its own element, and then it was pretty much every other attack had its own element. So if they kept that mechanic, I think they could have done a lot with it. Not that they didn't. Obviously, once they added like, the trickster styles, they already added the element of being like, hey, do you want to fight in this way or that way? And then obviously getting to the point of you can just switch on the fly and use every different mode for every weapon, which is just a beautiful thing in existence, where you have all 4 styles and you just use whatever weapon you want and just play around with it. But I think they definitely could have used that mechanic. I think had they built upon that, which once again, I completely understand why they wouldn't. They basically were like, we're not going to build upon anything that Devil May Cry 2 implemented at all. I understand. But that is like that, and basically, Sin Devil Trigger at the time. Those 2 mechanics, I do genuinely believe could have worked. Like I said, the ending thing where it's like your last little bit of health and then you trigger it. And I feel like a lot of games do have that mechanic where you do the special mode, but you have like, 1 to 2 ticks of health, and then it's like it's the ultimate power as like your final last bastion, and you get like a little meter reset, but it goes down really fast, and it's like, hey, we're giving you your chance. This is your final play, your last call, pull it off or die. A lot of games do actually have that mechanic, but for Devil May Cry specifically, I think they could have kept that one. And like I said, the elemental things, had they built that up, I think could have been amazing. And once again, I don't think that'll ever come back, which I do want to say sadly, because just thinking on it, like, yeah, that would have been a cool mechanic had they actually, built it up, and it's like, hey, I want to have, all of my Devil Trigger elements to be like fire based, even though obviously the weapons in 3 actually had like elemental stuff. In Devil May Cry 2, it wasn't like that. All your weapons were exactly the same. So maybe that's kind of where they got the inspiration for the elements. I'm just making crap up. I'm just saying. I do not know for a fact. But in 1 and 2, they don't really have that for elemental weapons. I think it's not Beowulf in the first game, I forgot. But that one, it's basically Beowulf, but it is flames. It is a fire elemental weapon. I think Artemis is technically in like the very first game too. No, that's in 3. They do have a gun that's very similar, and I can't remember what the element for that was. Maybe that was lightning. So they had the elements. They did have elemental stuff in the first game too. So they had it in the first 2, for sure. And then they kind of just got rid of it, and they kind of swapped out the elemental nature of things for the different trickster style, or different styles in general. And then it was like the elemental stuff really became more about the weapons, because obviously Cerberus was ice, Artemis was, an actual like laser weapon. Beowulf was just hand to hand, but of course if you go back to 5, Balrog is flames again. It does go back to fire, so it's like you do have the hand to hand combat weapon again, going back to the flame element. So it seemed like they kind of separated that mechanic from the game, but I wish they stuck with that and just had that become like an element. Like, all right, these enemies are weak to this, and then you can kind of just like an add a little layer, just like using the different styles. Although once again, once you hit the D-pad, then they got to updating that with just switching on the fly. It was like, okay, well, it's not the same as with 3, where it's like, all right, I prefer to use, trickster style, or I prefer gunslinger and stuff like that. I was always using the sword because I love using Cerberus. I think it was like that down circle, and you make the little sphere around you. That was like the coolest thing in the world to me. I was like, this is like the ultimate defense. And then you could go from a giant protective bubble like your Neji and freaking Naruto, and then you just make like a crazy like ice pillars or ice spikes. And I was like, this is the best one. Like I can do that forever. And then of course you can basically put on an entire rock show if you use Nevin or Nevan. I'm not entirely sure how to pronounce it. I always said Nevin, but you can just do like a whole insane rock show and just have lightning and bats shooting all over the effing place. It's like, I'm sorry, but I have to go with this. As much as I love, two-timing, which is sweet, and you shoot a handgun behind your back. That was like the coolest thing in the world when I first did that in DMC 2. I was like, I love that. It's a great move, but nothing's gonna beat, like making a lightning rock show with like bats and lightning, and then the crazy ice moves that you can do with Cerberus. So for me, it was always swordplay. Like that was just always my thing. I was like, it just feels more fun. And I feel like personally, I use the melee weapons way more than I use the actual, the guns and stuff. So for me, it was like, if I have to pick, I'm doing extra moves on my melee weapons because it just feels more valuable and it looks cooler. Like I said, as cool as the moves are for the weapons, and the melee weapons just seem cooler to me personally. But we'd love to know your thoughts on that, for DMC fans out there. But those are the mechanics that I think definitely would have fit as far as the Devil May Cry franchise if they kind of, kept them going and, stuck with them. I think the elemental thing for Devil Trigger definitely could have played a bigger part if they wanted to do that, where it's like, okay, some enemies are weaker to this, that, and the other. And I think that would have been cool. I think that would have been an interesting mechanic. But to jump from one Capcom franchise to another, Resident Evil. And Resident Evil has many mechanics across its storied history, but the one I'm going with, which it's going to be hard to tell if it ever makes a return, but honestly, it's the combat from RE6. Everything they did with that was utterly insane, but it was also really, really fun. If anything, it's odd how action-based that one is, and you can like crawl and roll around. You can literally crawl forwards, which is like like the muscles you have to have in your legs to be on the ground, and then you crawl forwards, and then it's basically impossible to crawl backwards on your back, and you just use your legs to push yourself backwards. That's like straight up impossible. But video games, you can just do what you want and they let you do it. But in Resident Evil 6, the combat mechanics that they have are really fun. And everybody has like their little quick shot moves, which I think were actually super cool. Of course, they built up the melee stuff starting with RE4, and then RE5 of course has it. And then in RE6, they just went balls to the wall, where it's like everybody has a quick shot mechanic depending on the character and like what main weapon they have. Like Leon had, Leon was about as close as you got to Dante because he would dual wield handguns. And so you could actually do that where you'd keep doing your quick shots, and it was like its own separate combo for different characters. If it was like their signature weapon, they could do like a specific thing. Of course, I always felt Leon's was the best because he actually had 2 guns, so he could shoot multiple enemies. I felt like everybody else, it was kind of just like one quick shot. But it's also been a long time since I played, so I'm sure like Chris probably shot somebody and then, I don't know, he probably head you and your head exploded or something. You know, it's Chris. I don't know, he probably kicked you in the nuts and your head went off to the moon. But I like that mechanic. I thought that was actually a cool feature that they had in terms of just the way the mechanics work for the game, just the way they did the combat, where it's like, hey, it doesn't always just have to be you shot somebody in the head or you shot them in the leg and now they're stunned, and then, you know, you press X or you press A and then you get a hit off. It's like now we've added an element of these quick maneuvers where you guaranteed, and they also had like energy based on that, so, you know, there was a lot of stuff stacked together when it comes to RE6. But I like the quick attack maneuvers, and I don't think it works if you're doing, you know, like if we're doing like RE2 and 3 remake, I don't think it works. Obviously having the dodge is totally different than having these fighting mechanics, but of course, getting back to, you know, where we are now with RE4 remake, I feel like it could have worked there. It's hard to say. I wouldn't say it would make the game too easy, because it's not like RE6 is just like excessively easy because you can do some quick shots, because once again, they tied it into basically a stamina mechanic where you have to like refill your energy to do it, or you kind of be tired out and you wouldn't be able to do those quick moves. And if I remember right, it was potentially also tied to your sprinting. I think if you did run in that game, it also had like a stamina meter. It's been so long since I played 6, so forgive me if I don't remember, you know, all the details of how these mechanics really played out. But I know for sure like the quick shot moves 100% were tied to like the stamina thing. Maybe sprint wasn't connected to that, but the quick shot moves, or just, you know, whatever the quick move, even if it was melee, all of those for sure had like, were tied to an energy bar. So I think that could come back if they go through that element of blending, you know, the action and the horror, which I think they did well in 4. And I think obviously, you know, if they carried this mechanic forward in the franchise, it would have to be unique to each character and maybe limited. It wouldn't have to be, you know, like Leon dual wielding where he gets off like 4 or 5 shots and that's like, you know, he ends the combo shooting both guns at one enemy. And it's like a cool thing where he's like turning around every time he does it. You could just do like, it's a simple move, almost like the dodge mechanic where every character has like one move that they can consistently do. And maybe you would have to tie it into an energy thing, or maybe just have it on an automatic timer where it's like, I think you could do that. You would just have to, obviously as you're playing, you would just have to like understand the mechanic of like, okay, I think it's been enough time, but maybe they could put like a sound effect in or something really simple that's like, depending on, I mean, once again, these are all mechanics I'm just making up off the fly, where it's like, you know, kind of mixing these things together, because I don't think it needs to be the full RE6 version. But if you toned it down and it was just like one move a piece, you could do it. And I'm sure there's an easy way to just put like, if it was something in the HUD where something changed colors, or like it could literally be like a straight line that appears or something like that, and it's like boom, you can do your quick hit maneuver, whether it's, you know, using your weapon or using a melee attack, or maybe every weapon could have a quick move, and it's just like maybe akin to how you have the parries now, where it's like obviously that's a straight up parry, so at the last minute, you know, you have to hit the button. Maybe it could be the same way. You could do it where, and this is just me hoping, I honestly think, and this is a good mechanic in a good game, but them adding the parry in RE4 I love, and I'm like, honestly, I want that to remain a staple for the rest of the franchise forever. I'm like, man, you have to keep it. I love that so much. Like I hope that stays in every game. And I still feel like it could be scary. You just kind of change how it works depending on the character and who does it. I feel like it can definitely work. So I hope that stays in general, but that's a good mechanic. A not so good mechanic, or a good mechanic, you know, in a bad game. Well, I don't hate it, but you know how it is. It's RE6. But as far as good mechanics and not so great games, I think the melee moves from 6 could transfer over. You just have to tone it down. You tone it down and still throw it in there, and it's just an extra option. Like I said, you know, keep it akin to the dodge in the RE3 remake, and just kind of develop it per game, per character. And it's like, all right, obviously with Chris, it would be like a melee move. I think we all know that. If they wanted to do it per weapon, I wouldn't hate it. But at that point, it would just be a quick shot for literally every single weapon. And I would like something that's more unique per character. Like if it was, you know, like I said, if it was Leon, maybe just give him basically a quick shot like his RE6 thing, or I don't know if I'd want a quick roundhouse. It would be cool to do, and obviously it's Leon, but I don't know. I want it to be something that's a little simpler. Like Chris doing a punch is still him staying on the ground. If you add a quick hit and it's Leon doing, a jump kick every time, it's like, it feels a little, as crazy as it is amongst all things Resident Evil, it feels a little crazy to just have a spin kick button, So I'd want it to still be stuff where they're, even if it's a main attack, like maybe he could just do a straight kick, or maybe he could just trip enemies. That would be something if he just did like a sweep. I could see a sweep more than a jump kick every single time. But it would be cool if they added that mechanic and it was just like, maybe, like I said, one move per character. Everybody does something a bit unique. And then you just kind of implement that in, have it on like a little timer. Or if they did bring back the whole energy mechanic, I'm not entirely sure how they would really do it. Because like I said, I wouldn't want it to be tied to that, or it's just like it's on a meter and stuff, because I'd also want to be able to sprint permanently. So I wouldn't want those two things. I wouldn't want it to be a stamina bar, in Resident Evil. So just add like one quick hit thing and just tie it to, just put it on a time limit, maybe every 10 seconds or so, which seems really small, but in the midst of combat, it's like that classic thing. Like if you just count 10 straight seconds, that's a decent chunk of time. So if you're fighting, if you're in the village in RE4 in that opening sequence, if you can't do a move but every 10 seconds, I promise you that's more than enough distance. Like when you're in the combat, you got to do a lot of shooting and fighting and running before that kick comes back, and you can only do it one time. And then it's like, okay, I stunned some people or I tripped a couple people, now let me get that out of here. And you got 10 seconds to figure out what you're gonna do. So I think 10 seconds actually is a decent chunk of time. Like I said, it seems really short, but if you just count it out, that's a good amount of time, in my personal opinion. Obviously, this is where actually designing a game comes into play and testing it and all that stuff. But I would love to see that mechanic come back, because I thought it was really fun. Obviously, it was a bit more over the top, and even the diving mechanics, I think they could bring that back as well. I'd love that mechanic of like the characters being able to dive on the ground. I think that's actually really cool. That does, once again, add to that element of like, pumping up the action just a bit. But I do think that went really well with those games. It was definitely like a fun mechanic where it also adds to the, to the strategy of combat as a whole, where it's like, okay, I have to die, multiple enemies coming at me. I'll dive off to the side so they can't hit me, and then I'm on the ground. I can aim at their legs and just, hit a bunch of people in the feet, that sort of thing. Like there's a lot that you can do with that, and it can still remain in that realm. Once again, testing and all that good stuff to make it not feel too weird. If it's like, I'm playing the Veronica remake and Claire's just dive. Well, Steve could do it. I mean, he jumped through an effing window with 2 gold guns. He could dive all day long, and it's like, well, that kind of fits. I mean, he jumped through a giant glass. Like, he should be dead, by the way, from doing that. I love talking about that though, because I'm like, they did that like it was nothing. I'm like, he jumped through a giant sheet of glass from a second story and was dual wielding a gun like it was the effing Matrix, shot up a monster, hit the ground, tucked and rolled, hopped right up, boom, boom, boom. I'm like, he's dead. But that always endeared me to Steve. I know what Steve has done. I know his character. I know his voice even. But he jumped through that window with 2 gold guns, and I was like, I kind of like this guy. So he's always got a place in my heart, because he did that ridiculous dive through a glass window that should have killed him 100%. But if I'm playing as Claire, it would kind of feel weird to be playing a Veronica remake and she's just diving sideways on the ground. Although, with the Bandersnatch, that would kind of be like the perfect mechanic to be able to dodge, and you just have to like jump out of the way of this giant stretchy arm coming at you. It kind of works. For that in particular, it works. Maybe that could just be, a kind of a QTE thing where you can just dive to the side, and that's how they do it. Maybe you can only dive on the ground in that particular instance. But for that specifically, it works. For everything else, it does get a bit too actiony. It would have to fit with the game. But if there were some tweaks and stuff, I genuinely believe the combat mechanics from Resident Evil 6 could be re-implemented into the franchise. They probably have to be toned down, like I said, and maybe make it just like one move. Some characters use their weapons. Some characters might use a melee move. Maybe it could, be melee moves for everybody, so that it's not just like, all right, this one enemy is like a million miles away, or it's the last person. I'll just quick shot them and then boom, they're dead. So just to keep that suspense, it's like, nope, it's only a melee move. It's only when you're swarmed, and then like every 10 seconds you can bust out, like if it's Leon, it's a sweep. If it's Chris, like I said, you know, give you a straight up Shoryuken or something buck wild like that. Everyone can get their own like melee move, just like they have, you know, just basically take a mercenaries move, a melee move, and then just add that to like a straight up button. You know, I think that would be cool. There would also be a lot of work to that because at this point, I think literally every single button on the controller in Resident Evil does get utilized. So maybe there would have to be some extra work done with that. But I'm sure something could be figured out. So I do think that mechanic could certainly work. But those are two games that I thought had some good mechanics. And I knew that it was going to be a Capcom-centric episode with this one. But I can't think of anything else. The only other thing I could think of was for a split second, Mirror's Edge was in my head. And it's not really a mechanic. It's just the fact that specifically Mirror's Edge Catalyst was open world. And because they had all the parkour and stuff in the game, it's just really good. Unfortunately, that game sucks. And it's just sad. It's very sad because I don't think we're going to get another chance with that one. But the open world element of that was cool. They just still somehow managed to make it kind of boring, which makes it even worse, oddly enough. But as far as straight up legit mechanics, Resident Evil with the just weird combat, you know, they were doing like omnidirectional combat before Call of Duty was ever doing it. It was the same thing. You could spin around and roll all over that from place. Resident Evil 6 had that. But maybe tone it down a bit and bring that back to Resident Evil. I think it could definitely play a good role. And for Devil May Cry, the elemental stuff being added to devil triggers, especially if you apply it as like weaknesses to specific enemies throughout the game, and you can like just swap your powers to, you know, weaken different enemies. Maybe you do a boss fight and it's like, oh, this boss is a little tougher for me. Boom, all fire or all lightning, depending on what they're weaker to, or all ice. And then it's like, sweet, it helps you out just that little extra bit. You can balance it out where all three of the elements are different, or you can do like 2 of one or 3 of one, because you're like, these are the specific enemies that always bother me, and then I can beat everybody else normally, and then these enemies I want to take down. Which, in a sense, I guess kind of somewhat applies to the DMC remake that they had, or I guess it was a reboot. It somewhat applies to that because of like the angel thing and the hell thing, where it was like you could only, at least in the original, you can only injure enemies based on them matching the color. And then they changed that when they did like the remastered version, where in the original, if you hit a demon with the opposite weapon, you literally couldn't do anything. Like you would just deflect off of them. And then they changed that in the reboot, or in the remaster of the reboot, where instead of it just blocking off of them, you would do damage, but it would be like, you know, way less significant. It would basically be like you do chip damage, but you can still do the combo and then switch to the other weapon, which, you know, I never played the remastered version of it, but I'm sure that actually helped a lot with that combat, because sometimes you have multiple enemies where you have to switch back and forth, and you could actually use the weapons in combos on like just base enemies. You could switch in between weapons and it would be like a running combo, and then if you came up against a specific enemy, it would just stop that combo dead in its tracks. And it's like, if you just let me hit them but less damage, I could still roll into the next move and it would be more entertaining. So I'm sure that helped when they fixed the reboot. I don't know if fix is the right term, but they made it better. They made it better. It was still fun to play combat wise, and I'm sure it got even more fun with the rebooted version. But like I said, the actual elemental stuff, I think could still make a bit of a return. At this point, it doesn't need to. I feel like DMC5 was so effing good. They don't need to add anything. Just make the weapons different and just, we're good. Like that's all they need. New weapons, that's it. They don't even need to add new elements. But if they did, I'd be more than happy. I'd be more than happy with that. But that's it for this video. Like I said, I would love to know what mechanics you guys feel are kind of trapped in, you know, just bad games, whether it's the only game in the franchise, or it's, you know, or well, I guess it would be the only game, or if it's one of many games within a franchise. I would love to know your thoughts. Like, what mechanics have you come across in gaming where you're just like, man, I wish that was not in this crappy game. I wish they, you know, fixed that or just developed it, made it a little bit better. So I would love to know your thoughts on that. Of course, there are tons of mechanics. You know, the first thing that comes to mind when I think of a mechanic that I think we all wish was in something else, at least if you're deep in the games, of course, the Nemesis mechanic. But I heard those games were good, so they didn't really count in this video. But of course, I wish, you know, the Nemesis mechanic was in just out in the world. I wish it wasn't patented. So that sucks. But in general, what mechanics are in some crappier games where you're like, this mechanic is great and I wish they just fixed it, or if it was just in more things. So please put your comments down in the comment section below. And of course, thanks for watching.